My name is Sean Andrew Seymour. My father is Scottish, of originally Irish descent. And on my mother's side, again, my mother is Filipino, born in the Philippines in one of the hospitals in Manila. And that was in the year 1987. So shortly after that, I came to Aberdeen in Scotland. I attended primary school there, a Roman Catholic primary school called St. Joseph's. Religion was a very major part of it. Assemblies, you would regularly see nuns throughout the school, as some nuns actually lived within the school. And it would be very common for Roman Catholic priests to come and speak to us as children. Then when I was 8, I moved to another primary school called Airy Hall, which was very much a more diverse primary school, and religion was a lot less of a focus. It was at this point I met some children who would ask me, do I believe in God? And at that time I had assumed that belief in God was just the default position. I didn't realize that there was another position in which people go, why do you believe in him? And so from the way these children that were my peers started to speak to me, it's almost as in this concept which is antithetical to science and learning. At this age, I began to have a slight hatred in my heart for this concept known as God. When it came time to go to secondary school, my parents wanted me to go to a school that my brother was already attending. I've got one older brother, his name is Stephen, and he's 3 years older than me. It was called Aberdeen Grammar School. One of the reasons that they wanted me specifically to go to that school was that it provided a special religious education class for Roman Catholic students. And of course they didn't realize that I had almost lapsed from my faith in religion, let alone Roman Catholicism. So as a child of half Filipino, half Scottish descent, I found it particularly hard to assess where do I fall in. And whilst throughout my primary school, I probably just felt white. When I got to secondary school, I think I began to notice differences, and these differences came about very subtly. When I would be picked up by my mom, if I would be seen by my mom, or if I would make a brief reference to my Filipino heritage, I began to hear this word chinky thrown around. And so I began to hang around with people that were also, like myself, mixed heritage, people that were of half Scottish, half Indian heritage, and I knew that they weren't necessarily the kind of company that I would want to introduce to my parents or would want a long-term friendship. So I began smoking at a relatively young age. It would not be uncommon for me to, for example, alcohol. It would not be uncommon at that age also to. Something made me just want to continue in order to kind of have that social clique that was also doing this. And I used to hear this since primary school. Your brother gets the best of grades and you're not from the kind of background which I would expect someone like you to be behaving from. So I thought to myself, what is it that I need to be doing? Why is it that I'm so different from my brother? I began to look into the purpose of my life and whether or not life has a wider purpose in the sense of what does life lead towards? And because I'm from a Roman Catholic background, and I was in a Roman Catholic religious studies class, I thought to myself, well, I've got a religion here, why don't I give it a chance? At the age of 14, I decided to do my first confession at a late age. So I can remember having to go and study with these younger kids who were doing it, and it was quite cringing, but at the time I felt, well, I want to get more religious, this is what it takes, let me go ahead with it. And I did feel that, to an extent, Roman Catholicism does offer these beautiful values which everyone can appreciate, and it does have this sense of morality. Then I came across one problem, which was that there's doctrine known as the Trinity, the belief that God exists in the form of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that unified tri-union is actually the concept we know as of God. So I went to ask someone that was quite senior in the church, in my city at least, and he tried to explain it to me. And in the end, I basically decided that the Trinity was not something I could follow, and I attempted to look into other religions. At this time, I must say, this was the year 2002. 9/11 had happened the year before, and so not many people are looking towards Islam. I must add as well, my dad moved to Egypt for 3 years, and I visited him quite frequently. But when he was in Egypt, I was never interested in Islam, so to speak. As a child, I was more interested in viewing the pyramids. But one thing that did happen, which was interesting, was the tour guide we had in Egypt, his name was Muhammad. He was a local Egyptian. And in the car, he mentioned that Muslims believe in Jesus. So at the time, I was like, how can you believe in Jesus? And if you believe in Jesus, then you must believe what Jesus said, which is that he is the Son of God. And he kind of said, well, we don't believe he ever said that in the first place. So I found that really interesting that Muslims actually believe in Jesus as well. I didn't ask him any further questions, but before I left Egypt, I picked up a translation of the Quran, which was extremely dusty and kind of old, and it wasn't printed very well. This Quran stayed in my house, accumulating dust for ages. But when I found out that Baha'ism, which was one of the religions I wanted to look into, was an offshoot of Islam, I thought to myself, why not give Islam a chance? So I picked up this Quran, I looked into it, and I read this book, and I believe that the book communicated with me directly in a way that other scriptures don't. The Quran, if you're into order and sequence, you might find it very confusing. 1 minute it's speaking about Moses, the next minute it might be speaking about Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. And in that sense, whilst most people are completely against the way that the Quran is written, whilst reading it, I felt that this book has something in it. And I read that it had the names of the previous prophets I once believed in as a Christian. Moses, David, Solomon, and all these other individuals. So I began to look online about Islam, and I began to read people's conversion stories, read what Muslims were saying, and watch debates between Muslims and non-Muslims. And through that, I would say I realized, yes, I do want to convert. But I thought, let me meet some Muslims first. So I met some Muslims in Scotland who were also converts, and I felt to myself, well, look at the guys' disciplines. It's amazing the way they've disciplined their lives, and I definitely want to kind of embrace this. I had personally taken my first Shahada on the internet with one person who was a Muslim that I was speaking to on MSN. He said that was valid, but after about 1.5 years of going to the mosque, the Imam at the local mosque, he told me that no, your Shahada is not valid, and rather you need at least 2 witnesses. He said just for formalities, just in case you want to ever go visit Mecca and do these things, it's better for you to have a certificate saying that you've officially taken Shahada. So I officially took my Shahada at the end of the age of 16, I believe. And I said that in front of a mosque in Aberdeen. I can remember when I initially converted, it was not the most of happy times. I was having a few issues with my family particularly. They weren't too understanding because they thought I was a bit too young to make such a large decision. Their philosophy in life is that when you're young, you should go out, enjoy yourself, experience the world, then make such a big decision. Then I felt the other side of the pressure, which was coming from my peers at high school. We were going through an age in which most kids my age would have been choosing to go out and test that intermittent period between childhood and adulthood, where you experiment with some of the things that adults are perceived as doing. And at this period of time, I felt really reclusive because I felt there was not many people I could speak to. I couldn't speak to my family because they weren't too understanding and they thought I was just going through some silly phase. And at the same time, my friends would also have thought that I was turning out to be a bit of a freak, because it's very rarely that someone perceives these kind of issues and thinks about the importance of the meaning of life at such a young age. And so from that perspective, I felt extremely isolated at this period of time. One might question, why didn't I turn to the Muslim community to seek some kind of solace there? Because many Muslims who were brought up Muslim at the age that I was at that time, namely 15, 16, they also were going through phases in life where they maybe wanted to explore what it's like to hang around with non-Muslims and enjoy a non-Muslim lifestyle. So they could not relate to me either. I can remember during this period of time, I would often lock myself in my room, just sit on the computer and read, and one might argue that I went through some phases of minor depression. It certainly affected my social life heavily, and I'd say I lived between the dilemma of living a normal life and at the same time trying to affirm myself with what many converts go through when they try to affirm a distinct Muslim identity for themselves. So whilst I might act normal and act like the same person I was amongst my friends, on weekends I would be a very different person, and I might choose to embrace some of the clothing and some of the dress which is commonly associated and affiliated with being outwardly Muslim. For example, the dishdasha, which is the long Arab robe, and also the hat. And so I was very much living a double life, one inside the home and amongst my friends, and one outside of the home. So I can remember desperately at this time wanting to get away from my home city and migrate to somewhere where perhaps more people my age could relate to me. At this point, I very much turned to what we might call friends and contacts online who were of a similar mindset and were converting to Islam at a very similar age to my own. If I could have gone back in time, there's a few things I would have done differently. Those things are perhaps I would have been in more frequent contact with my father, my dad, about particularly how I was feeling during the process of my embracing Islam and adopting a new religion. And more importantly, I would assess just the general way I engaged with my friends and my family at that time. I wish I had done things differently, and I wish I had tried to explain things more thoroughly as opposed to just expecting them to be happy with such a big decision that occurred at the time. It was 2002, there was a lot of social pressures. My dad absolutely despised Muslims. He didn't take it too well. Needless to say, our relationship wasn't that great prior to me converting. And he personally thought that at the time I was doing it just to kind of do something to annoy him and kind of go through a silly phase. So I converted when I was 15, and I kept my faith very much to myself. I would pray, and I would go to the mosque on weekends. Most Muslims believe that you can only eat meat which has been slaughtered in a particular way according to what Islamic law stipulates, which is that it needs to be slaughtered in the name of God. It's very similar to, of course, the regulations of kosher law, which the Jews believe in. I knew realistically that at the time I was just going to have to follow the minority view, which is that you can eat meat slaughtered by Jews and Christians, because at the time I knew that in this situation, my mom is not going to accept if I tell her, cook me vegetables only. It was difficult enough for me to tell her I don't like pork anymore, let alone anything else. So I just had to compromise in that situation. I knew that telling my parents would be a bombshell, and I tried to do it in a more cowardly way, I'd say. So what I did was, with my mom, I just made it really known by playing Islamic lectures in my room and by playing nasheeds. It was just obvious for my mom, who was living with me, what was happening. As for my dad, I knew that my brother and my mom wouldn't keep their mouths closed about this. So I knew that the news would eventually reach him. At the time, he was living in Vietnam. And it did reach him. And unfortunately, he didn't take it in the best of manners. I received a nasty phone call. And he basically said that my son's not a Muslim, my son's not an Arab. So I tried to assure him, I tried to say that at the time I was quite stubborn, and as I mentioned, I didn't have too great a relationship with him. So I said to him, well, in the UK we have freedom of religion, and I can choose to be wherever I want to be. And he said, well, you might have freedom of religion in the UK, but there's no such thing as freedom of religion in my house. So you can either choose to leave and choose to receive the benefits of being my son, or you can choose to become Muslim and see if the Muslims will pay for you to go to university and pay for your life. And at that time, there's a harsher reaction than I had expected. I did get very, very upset about it, and I did begin to think to myself, what am I going to do? Because it doesn't look like my dad's going to get over this at any point. But at the same time, I really don't think I can stay away from what I believe to be the truth just because my dad is telling me you're going to have to go through hardship. So I wanted to have the best of both worlds, and as we say in English, have my cake and eat it at the same time. So I just said that's fine to my dad, which implied that I wasn't going to be a Muslim, but at home I remained a Muslim. I kept receiving all these books and I kept listening to these lectures. So when I went to visit my dad in Vietnam, that's when the real encounter happened, and that's when he sat me down and said to me, I'm not paying for you to be a Muslim. So it's quite unfortunate, but I spoke to my grandparents, his mom, and they kind of interceded for me and said, at the end of the day, he's still your son, and you did many things that we didn't approve of when you were a child, yet we didn't really abandon you. And so we came to this agreement that I could be a Muslim and still be under his support, so to speak, on the condition that all my activities were kind of well known to him, and basically he wanted to keep an eye on me, and they were very worried that I would go down an extremist route. After a few months, I think I went through a nasty habit of trying to do things too quickly. And so I tried to kind of become the ideal Muslim whilst my home situation wasn't ideal. People on the internet who were trying to encourage me to do things too quickly and too fast. And due to that, I went through what a lot of converts call Salafi burnout. Salafi burnout is something that a lot of converts experience when they try and do things way too quickly and try and adopt a strict regime into their lives Islamically. Due to the fact that I was trying to go too extreme and the fact that my peers were not enjoying it and they felt, what the hell's happening to our old friend? I kind of lapsed, and to some extent, I lost my faith because I began to think to myself, well, why is life getting so tough for me? Why is my dad so upset with me? Why is my mum and my brother so upset with me? And why are my friends not speaking to me anymore? When I was at university, I met some brothers who followed a particular understanding of Islam, and through reading the books they gave me, I realized I was doing things in the completely wrong way before, and that there's no surprise that I fell back slightly. And yeah, after that, after reading these books and after trying to get hold of everything I could in the English language and reading it, I realized that the English language isn't really sufficient for the needs that I have. I decided that at the time I was studying what's called legal studies, which is a law course in Aberdeen, Scotland. I decided that I kind of need to break away from this because I'm spending all my time reading these religious books. And I need to get out and kind of study Islam properly. So I heard about this course in London, which is at the Islamic College for Advanced Studies. It's a Hausa course in Arabic. It's got Arabic as well as Islamic studies. So I thought, why don't I read in this course? That way I can understand Islam academically as well as according to the traditional understanding. So I moved up to London at the age of 19 to do so. And I'd say I haven't looked back since. After doing those 3 years of Arabic, I went to Syria to study for about a year and a half, where I picked up Arabic at the University of Damascus as well as the traditional Islamic seminary, the Hausa, in the area known as Sayyidah Zainab. And ever since then I've been kind of reading books in Arabic. When I moved to London, I made quite a few friends, and I kind of told them that I want to get married at this point. And so at the time a few people were suggested to me, and I made contact with my present wife, and with her parents' permission. After a while I realized that I do want to get married to my wife because she seems to have the traits that I would like in a wife, and she seems to also be curious and keen to progress and develop in her understanding of religion. And one thing that I liked was the fact that she was not opposed to the fact that I was studying religion as my kind of main area of interest. As is common with my mom, she was okay with it at first, but then very nearer to the date, she began to panic. And despite telling me that she wouldn't tell my dad, and she would allow me to tell my dad personally. She contacted my dad before I had the chance, and at the time, me and my dad didn't necessarily have the best of relationships, and I think I was doing things in a very wrong way. I thought my dad would take it very badly if I told him, but quite contrary to my understanding, I think my dad would have been a lot more understanding had I told him before anyone else and had I approached him at first. Rather, I think it's partially my fault because I don't make so much of an effort to inform my dad of these things. So he got very, very upset. We had a series of conversations, the last one being the night before the wedding itself, and he told me that, again, if you go ahead with this, you do realize that you might very well be on your own, and I'm gonna cut off contact. I wrote him a long email. I tried to explain my feelings in that email. And eventually, I think when he read the email and he saw that my feelings were coming out and I managed to articulate myself, he felt, well, okay, I'll give him a chance here. And I admire his courage in going ahead with this. And ever since then, I've kind of, alhamdulillah, I've realized that whenever I'm making a big decision or something big is happening in my life, my dad is the first person I need to inform. My relationship with my parents is very good now. So I'm in phone contact with my dad quite frequently. And my mum, I travel to Scotland to see her when I can. But she's come up to see me and she's come up to meet my daughter as well. So. I think that when it comes to the Muslim community assisting new converts, one thing they need to do is just be a bit more down to earth. Sometimes converts gain an immediate, almost celebrity status. So, from my experience, converts can either be treated in two ways. Either they can be completely ostracized by people staring at them and finding them weird and thinking, what's this person who's not from our ethnic background doing in our mosque? In which case, their staring and over curiosity can lead the convert to feel quite uncomfortable. So they should tend not to do this. At the same time, you have the other extreme, which is approaching the convert and trying to become his best mate and trying to put him forth to all the people as, oh look, this new convert, he's joined our religion, that shows our religion's true, and essentially making converts into almost celebrities in the mosque. Again, I think that also does not need to be done because it can sometimes make the convert's head too big, and it can sometimes it leads to reverts thinking that they're really something special compared to the average Muslim, when in reality we're all human beings and we're all trying to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I would say that they should try and befriend the convert, but at the same time don't expect that, as with our normal friendships in life, it takes us years to choose the right friends, either through school or through knowing them in our neighborhoods. And we don't just naturally become friends with someone just because we share a few things in common. So therefore, just because you're Muslim and someone's a convert doesn't mean that you're automatically going to become their best friend. And my advice to some new converts that convert is, one experience I had myself was, I've learned since converting and making some of the mistakes that I've done in my conversion process, that converts ought to realize that just as it may have took them many experiences in life in order to actually eventually come to Islam, that when they newly practice Islam, that should also come to them gradually. So they need to stick to that which is what we might say the necessary aspects of Islam. They should learn those things first. And when it comes to those things which are recommended and they're not compulsory, I would suggest that they go into those things gradually as opposed to just immersing themselves entirely in and trying to do essentially a crash course in Islam, which would normally take the average Muslim years to learn over their childhood. I don't think they should try and immerse themselves into that immediately, because sometimes when one does so, it just is a bit too intensive and it's a bit too much for them, so they end up burning out occasionally. And so my advice would be, take things gradually and stick to the basics, then move on to the advanced things.